So the first part of this talk will really be a very gentle introduction to the Eastern teachings that A discovered through the Theosophical Society and through his reading and his meditation, and then walking the path of meditation. And then we'll move from that to examine some of his meditative experiences in the light of a particular aspect of an Indian spiritual tradition that he didn't follow, but which explains his experiences very precisely and clearly, which is essentially the Kundalini experience from the Tantric tradition. And then we'll kind of come to a close by synthesizing that and looking at the wider ramifications of what this spiritual work meant in the context of A's creative life more broadly, and what we can learn from this idea of serpent power, which I'll also be considering in the context of goddess or the divine feminine principle. So this is obviously a huge subject, and I'm going to let the visuals carry the weight of it in some ways, and really just using words and ideas to evoke almost musically some key concepts and key experiences from A's work. So that's by way of introduction. This is Bellerophon on Pegasus. It's to me a wonderful image of inspiration, elevation, and illumination. And vision, in so many ways, is what A's work was all about. His engagement with these subjects begins with spontaneous childhood illuminations, which he describes in the Candle of Vision. For example, walking around Loch Ney and suddenly discovering this very ancient spirituality, this gift of vision in him, to his complete surprise. And spontaneous awakenings are very much a part of the typology of the mystic, I suppose you'd say. And they're very important. Most people who give their life to these subjects, they will have had some awakening that bowled them over and made them a different person. But spontaneous mystical experiences are often not enough. They're enough to whet the appetite, but the next question that follows from that is, what does it all mean? And many people who've had a spontaneous awakening, the next question is there a framework to explain what's happened to me? And is there a systematic way to have these experiences again in a more controlled, more regular way and compare them? And of course, very much what A's path became. And he discovered the framework, the ideas that began to put a shape on his mystical experiences through the Theosophical Society, and specifically through Indian spiritual philosophy. So this will really be the end of the talk, but I just wanted to say, why have I used the phrase serpent power? So serpentine imagery, or everything that's encompassed in that, appears repeatedly in A's visual iconographic language, sometimes in a veiled way, more often. But the experience that he articulates in the Candle of Vision is very much consonant with the Kundalini awakening of Eastern tradition. And once that's understood, then the universal significance of the image of the serpent, I think, becomes very important to studying A and what his work achieved. I'm just going to summarize really that in our Western tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the serpent has a rather sinister connotation. We think of the temptation, Eden, the fall, and so on and so forth. But it was always more complex than that, even in our own tradition. I went to the Church of Ireland, St. Patrick's Cathedral this morning, because Patrick was said to have banished the serpents, and I thought, if I'm giving a talk about the serpent power, I should consider whether the serpents really were banished. And the first thing I saw on one of the great west windows, in a triptych on one of the west windows, was an image of Moses with the brazen serpent coiled around the pole. And this is the great biblical image of, if you like, the good side of the serpent power, which is healing. And there is an ancient stratum of mystery associated with the image of the serpent, which is, it's ambiguous. It is venomous, but you can also create cures from that venom, from the anti-venom. So there's a whole thread of the idea of homeopathy, of like curing like, of mastering trouble through that trouble, which the serpent in many ways exemplifies. And Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine is an astounding meditation on many ways on how the serpent, in a way, is both the symbol of our ignorance and of our great potential enlightenment at the same time. So I didn't know when I suggested to Patrick that that I talked about serpent power, that the theme of this weekend would be healing, but actually the serpent, specifically the serpent on the pole, is the great Western symbol of healing, as we'll remind ourselves at the end of the talk. So that's why serpent power. Now, moving on. A in vision. A typically saw spirit figures to have a luminous aura, and specifically radiance around the head. And in fact, if after this talk you look at some of the images on the walls, you'll see various spirit figures who have this radiant, either rays or flower-like forms coming from their head. And it's quite clear that he actually saw figures like that with his clairvoyant illumination. And as Raymond was pointing out yesterday, A aimed to acquire the power of light in the body. It's this ancient idea that sight is light, and the more illuminated we are, the more we see the light, the luminosity in other beings. So that the mark of an illuminated being is that they radiate, and they also awaken other people's power of seeing and of radiating. So light is our guide. Also heat, because it's not just the radiation of light. So the power of heat in the body is another yogic power. The Tibetan yogis, for example, had a practice called tumo, well, they still do, where they can create so much intense heat in their bodies that they can dry cloth that have been wet, freezing cold water cloths. They can dry with the power of heat generated by their yoga. So this is the inner powers of the body that yoga claims to awaken in the student. Another image, so just to show another example of what A called in his writings the dragon crest, the kind of symbol of awakening in the head, which can be seen as rays or as these sort of floral forms. Just to mention the Theosophical Society briefly, because it was so very much through the Theosophical Society that W.B. Yeats, Charles Johnston, and that young, enthusiastic circle of friends discovered the vast wealth of Eastern spiritual literature. So, as I said, I'm not a professional Sanskritist. I know there's at least one person in the room here who is, a Sanskrit scholar, and I'm not. So this is going to be as much as I know and can summarize briefly. But Indian texts, specifically Indian religious and spiritual texts, are some of the oldest literature in the world, and some of the profoundest. So, and I've just picked representative examples of texts that AE would have been exposed to, or that the ideas within them. So, ancient great motherlode of Indian tradition, the Vedas, which can be seen as religious texts, but they're full of mythology, philosophy, guides to ritual practice, mantras, and so on and so forth. There are 4 classical Vedas. The Samaveda is one of them. And in fact, part of them, the Upanishads, great philosophical text that meant so much to AE, and in some ways he in his teaching he was trying to convey in a simple way to his students the leading thoughts of the Upanishads. So one of the Upanishads will be the Chandogya Upanishad, and we're going to look at a saying from that Upanishad. When the Upanishads were discovered by the West around the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, they were revolutionary because obviously there was no Western Christian post-classical society had no concept that these incredible philosophical riches were unknown to the West, untranslated as yet, until a series of scholars started sharing them to the West. And the philosophers at the time, the Western philosophers, saw that many of what were considered the greatest thoughts of contemporary philosophy, such as the German philosophers Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, they're already contained in some ways in a more profound form in the Upanishads. And then you have a vast number of other forms of literature, the Puranas, Shastras, the Sutras. And I've mentioned the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali because A's path very much, can be understood through someone who's read the Yoga Sutras. So there are 4 or 5 great sayings in the Upanishads, each of which was important to A and formed part of his personal meditation program. And in fact, each of the 4 main Upanishads, as it were, is concerned with an idea or a principle, which was summarized in a great saying that you could give a lifetime, or from an Indian perspective, many lifetimes to meditating on. So Mahavakya, the great utterances, the great sayings of the Upanishads. So Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that, the great teaching that, in contrast to the apparent separateness of life, a world where in our state of illusion, we seem to be many different beings made of different things, of different levels of intelligence or consciousness or whatever. No, for anything that there is, thou art that, the basic teaching of oneness, closely connected with the Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. So again, classic Indian teaching, what am I in your depth? Are you just a mortal lump of flesh that perishes after about 70 years? Are you just a soul? Well, actually, each of us, and indeed every being, is fundamentally God or the divine or the universal existence. Extending that, Pranyanam Brahma, Brahman is consciousness. So what is the nature of that self? Well, it is many things, but most usefully, it's consciousness. So with our consciousness and our awareness, what we don't see, almost because it's the background to everything we experience, is the divine is that consciousness, as it were, seeing itself through itself in myriad forms all the time. As I look at you and you look at me, that's the divine being aware through itself, of itself all the time. I am Atma Brahma. This self is the Brahman. So the great teaching of the Atman, the self, which he meditated on for many years, to find the self, the Atman, very profound experience. But then the Upanishadic saying from the Mandukya Upanishad is that self is not a separate self for each of us. However lofty that self you might find in meditation is, that self itself is Brahman, is the divine. So that's the theory, if you like. For a reader of the Upanishads, it seems wonderful if you're attracted to this sort of idealistic philosophy. It was consonant with the most advanced philosophical thought of the 19th century, but what's the proof of it, if you like? You could almost say, as the Upanishadic teaching is the theory, the practice or the verification of it is through yoga. So what is yoga? I'm sure many people in the world do think that it's simply a form of exercise or gymnastics or keep fit that you can do in a local gym, Eastern gymnastics. Well, no, it's a lot more than that. The word yoga is connected with all our words like yoke, union, jugular, things that join. And what does yoga join you? Well, it rejoins us to our true self and to the divine and to each other. So that's the yoga. It's the reconnection to reality, yoga. And in, I would say, very classically Indian fashion, there isn't just one yoga, there are several. And the idea was, it depends on your temperament, on what kind of person you are, what kind of yoga you need. So there's an intellectual form of yoga called Jnana Yoga, which is the yoga of contemplation and philosophy. So for very much what becomes Advaita Vedanta, where you'd be working with the great sayings, the Mahavakya, and gradually through contemplation and understanding coming to this sense of union where it stops just being theory. I'm presenting all this, of course, in the from a believer's perspective, because for AE, he felt that he had this experience that indicated this. But there are other forms of yoga, like bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, veneration, the yoga of love for God, whichever God. And of course, in the Indian tradition, there are many gods. But a bhakti yoga would fasten with devotion and one pointed mind and heart on a deity. They would chant mantras to the god. They would live acts of service. And through their sheer power of emotion and connection, theory of bhakti yoga is oneness with that god and then with Brahman in general is attained. Raja yoga, the path of controlled meditation. Karma yoga, the path of good works, of learning how to do. In fact, one of the most profound yogas in the whole Indian tradition, the yoga of the Bhagavad Gita, where we don't need to go to a cave in the Himalayas, we don't need to retire into a monastery. If we live right in attunement with our dharma, our duty and purpose, then the union is attained. So that said, asceticism and a certain control of life was always part of yoga. So this is an image of one of the most famous yogis ever, Gautama Buddha. So of course, the whole religion that grew out of Hinduism and challenged it was the result of enlightenment experienced by a yogi, Buddha. So just a couple more reference points for AE before we get down to the nitty gritty. Samkhya philosophy and Raja Yoga. So Samkhya is kind of aligned with yoga, is not necessarily a kind of yoga, but as a thought system, very important to AE and in theosophy, because it's a way of discovering the self through distinguishing it through the not self. So typically in Samkhya, you would meditate on what you are, and you begin with the body and say, I'm aware of the body, but I am not my body. And then I'm aware of my emotions, but I'm not identical with my emotions. I'm aware of my mind, but I'm not my mind. So contra to Descartes with this, I think, therefore I am. No. That means, from a meditator's perspective, the self goes beyond the mind. And through this process of not that, gradually rolling back to experience the self, the Purusha, the Atman, essential attitude for the meditator. And think of a three-ely place with his little group of friends and theosophists, and he's almost like the spiritual leader of this little ashram in central Dublin, just off Stephen's Green. They are living a yogic life. They're vegetarian. They were celibate, or in theory, when they were living there, they were celibate. They were meditating regularly. They were taking spiritual adventures, trips into nature. They were living like a little ashram, and AE was, I'd say, almost the guru of that group. And Raja Yoga lays out the rules of the kind of life that a yogi would have followed. So classically, the 8 limbs, the Ashtanga of Raja Yoga: yama, abstinences; niyama, observances. So there are 5 abstinences and 5 observances, and they're almost like 10 commandments, except the principle. So abstinences: don't kill, don't steal, these kind of things. Niyama, observances, so practice contentment, practice truthfulness. They're not commandments in the sense that a god is saying do this or you're going to hell. They are rules of life in the sense of this is the path to peace and focus and yoga. This is the foundation of the yoga life, and AE lived the yoga life. Asana, correct bodily posture. So we learn the lotus position, or there are many asanas, and they each suit particular kinds of consciousness. Pranayama, breathing. So this has become quite well known in mindfulness, and even in contemporary medicine. People are discovering that if you breathe in a patterned way, it can affect consciousness, it can affect health, it can lower blood pressure, it can have other good effects. But pranayama is a lot more than that. It's to do with regulating one's energies, learning how to draw in energy, learning not to be either to active or passive in relation to life. And then once that foundation was laid, pratyahara, withdrawal from the senses, dharana, concentration, dhyana, meditation, and samadhi, absorption. So the point I'm trying to make in giving you these words from the tradition is A and his friends were living the yoga life. And in fact, they would have known these terms, but the point is they were living the life, and it's a whole life approach to harmony and oneness from that perspective. So certain results can follow from leading the yoga life. And this is a wonderful quote from the Candle of Vision, which is what actually gave me the idea of giving this particular talk. A says, and I'd love to hear your Irish translation of this at some point, Raymond. A says, once at the apex of intensest meditation, I awoke that fire in myself of which the ancients have written, and it ran up like lightning along the spinal cord, and my body rocked with the power of it. And I seemed to myself to be standing in a fountain of flame, and there were fiery pulsations as of wings about my head, and a musical sound not unlike the clashing of cymbals, with every pulsation. And if I'd remembered the ancient wisdom, I might have opened that eye which searches infinitude. But I remembered only in a half terror of the power I had awakened, the danger of misdirection of the energy, for such was the sensation of power that I seemed to myself to have opened the seal of a cosmic fountain. So I remained contemplative and was not the resolute guider of the fire. So, fascinating, almost kind of like Coleridge's man from Porlock, that, you know, the experience went thus far and stopped. But the point at issue is this is a very classical description of a Kundalini experience. But A was not a Kundalini yogi, so he didn't have the framework, he didn't have the technology in his mind to enable him to, as you say, open that eye and guide that fire. Now, so I'm going to move on, having done yoga in theory and practice, to just say a few words about Kundalini in the tantric tradition. One particular aspect of yoga, tantra yoga. And maybe, yeah, I'll just speak to it in the beginner's way that one would, from this diagram. So, although it's not pictured here, what would be visualized here at the base of the spine in this lotus flower, or chakra, as they're called, chakra meaning wheel, also known as padmas, lotus flower, was visualized a serpent coiled around itself 3.5 times. And this serpent represented, well, and is the Shakti, the Kundalini Shakti, the feminine goddess energy that resides for Tantra Yoga at the base of the spine. And what is said is that through certain techniques, although it can also happen spontaneously, and I know of more than one person it has happened spontaneously to, this fire at the base of the spine can be awakened. And if it does, so it is said in the tradition, it uncoils like a serpent uncoiling from the base and rises up the central nadi. There are 3 nadis or nerves, the central column of Sushumna, and the red nadi of Pingala, and the white nadi of Ida. So these, you know, they're not nerves, they are energetic formations which the yogi experiences when they do yoga, and which many people spontaneously learn to experience and see. And generally our energy is said to just move through the twining serpents around the Sushumna. But if the Kundalini is awakened, like a fiery serpent, it gradually rears up through these chakras, and as each chakra is awakened by the Kundalini, so it is said in the tradition, certain powers arise. Magical powers, psychic powers, visions, things that A.E. said, intense energy, rocking. Typical experiences would be jerking, shuddering, trembling, intense heat. If there's some blockage, pain in the spine, and hence the A.E. was quite right to know that there are dangers in the experience. The chakras, known as Muladhara, the root support, there where the yogi sits. Svadhisthana, the one's own sweetness. Manipura, the jeweled city. Anahata, the unstruck center, like a bell that has not struck. Vishuddha, the pure center, and then the Agya center, the third eye there. And the ultimate result of this awakening for Tantra Yoga is that the power ascends all the way to the crown chakra, not properly pictured, and there a supreme ecstatic experience of illumination is said to occur. Now, this has a religious dimension, which has got a bit lost as Tantra has become popular in the West, and people think that it's about sex, which is part of it, or that it's a form of massage or whatever. Well, it has a spiritual view of love, but it is fundamentally a spiritual path. So I wanted to show the somewhat conventional image of Shiva, the god of the yogis, the great god of the yogis, and I want to particularly draw attention in the conventional iconography to the serpent at his throat and to his blue color, because the religious idea behind Kundalini Yoga, looked from this perspective, is that, as it were, Shiva is the consciousness which is separate in the head, which is separated from his wife, Shakti, who is there, down there at the base of the spine. The lovers are separated, and yoga is about bringing the lovers together in a marriage. And so, in a sense, she, Shakti, the goddess, the serpent power, is life, the life in everything. And Shiva, thus, in a sense, is death. But he's also the mastery through death, which is why his blue color is, in a sense, the color of death, specifically death through poisoning, because he's associated with serpent venom. And one of his great yogic acts, Lord Shiva, Lord of the Yogis, was to drink venom. So the throat, as it were, is the throat that has been poisoned through drinking venom. But this is his mastery. And on the right, this is, I suppose, as it were, the result of the yogic path of Kundalini Yoga, which is Ardhanarishvara. So the marriage of Shiva Shakti in an androgynous being. They've become, so you can see that here Shiva Shakti has one breast, one female breast, and one not female breast, female leg wear, and the Nandi of the male side on the right, and so on and so forth. So this is the great mystic marriage, as it were, which is also the real emotional significance of this work. We're not just driving energy up our spine, or Kundalini yogis aren't, to gain powers or to have some weird experience. They are enacting a great work of love within themselves, reconnecting nature and spirit, you might say. And I think that religious spirit is very much there in AE, although he took it in a completely different way, which will be the third and the final part of this talk, really. So I've described AE as a yogi. I've described a clear Kundalini experience that AE had and describes in the Candle of Vision. But he was not a Kundalini yogi. That's the interesting thing. He didn't really focus on these, the chakras, the visualizations of them, the prana, the subtle energy in the body. He was focused on the self, the nobility of the human self, its heroic ancestral virtue in his yogic life. But he had another whole other part of his spiritual life that he was bringing in a mystic marriage together with his yogic side. So I say, well, the serpent power, the Kundalini, it wasn't really discussed in the Theosophical Society. They knew all about it. Blavatsky knew all about it, but she didn't want to drop information that people could abuse, because, I mean, a typical thing that happened when these kind of ideas started becoming known in the West was that people would read about breathing exercises and then they'd start trying to invent breathing exercises. What generally happens then is that they get breathlessness because they interrupt the body's automatic ability to breathe. And so people would get in a mess, or by messing around with their body energies, people have given themselves intense spinal problems and other yogic accidents. And so this is why Blavatsky kept quiet about it, and also because she had her own ideas about the Kundalini, more in line with the Tibetan Buddhist views, where the the root centers and the sex centers were not as important as the heart. And she'd been given a rather secret tradition, so it was really too much for Blavatsky to say, firstly, it's dangerous, and secondly, I can't tell you the secret tradition I've received. So she just avoided it. But A did receive teachings about subtle energies and these things through certain friends in the Theosophical Society. James Morgan Price, who had been Blavatsky's printer and knew her work in her esoteric school. Jasper Neiman, the pen name of Julia Cately, who had the ability to see her own chakras, energy centers. And both of them shared this knowledge with A, and of course he was having his own awakenings at the time. But the information was secret even in the Theosophical Society. That said, there was information in a book called Nature's Finer Forces by Rama Prasad, which really introduced tantric physics to the West. And I think there's something interesting that A and Yeats had kind of separated spiritually in a way, because Yeats went to look for Western wisdom and he joined the Golden Dawn. But in the Golden Dawn, he started learning about the tattvas and meditation on tantric symbols. So they weren't, again, A and Yeats, they're often moving apart and then coming together through what they were doing. It's a weaving pattern throughout their lives. So there was information for A to study the energy centers in the body, but it wasn't his leading focus. I would say much more important to A was the relationship of the Shakti and the Serpent Power to his outer philosophy and his love of nature. Now, what I mean by that is a tantric yogi studies the chakras in their body, the energy centers, and they're, as it were, looking at their body as if it were a world or kingdom in itself, compared to a sacred mountain, or to the universe or to a deity. A was looking for these same forces in nature. He spoke of fountains of Hecate, that was his term for these great upwelling sources of energy. You'll see them pictured in many of his paintings. He's not looking for these upwelling forces in his body, but in the landscape. He's not looking for deities in his chakras. He's meeting the people of the Shi in the landscape. That was where he was finding his Shakti. So I love this image. Painting's not called the Serpent of the Celestial Waters. It's just a phrase that seemed to me to be consonant with it. So you'll see, once again, the luminosity around the spirit beings and the radiance of the head and the crest. But here, the serpent, the sea dragon or serpent on which they ride, is very much this symbol of the roiling, twisting life energies in nature. So just to move back to more like a Tibetan Buddhist view, there's a representation of a stupa or a chorten, as they call them in Tibet. And for a Tibetan yogi, as I was saying, contra A, the focus is very much on the interior world, the body. So the stupa represents the universe. It also represents the sacred mountain, Mount Meru in India. And the yogi will meditate on their body as if it is the world or the sacred mountain. Thus the great luminosity in the head. Buddha and Saint Francis, who is also typically represented with a halo. I'll move on. But A was moving always to finding this beautiful Shakti power in nature. So I'm just going to wrap up now because we started a bit late, and I want to leave a little time for questions if people have any. But just returning to this idea of the image of a serpent in the Western tradition. So representation of Nehustan, the brazen serpent, the serpent on a pole. This is from Book of Exodus, where, as you may well know, Moses has led the Israelites out into the desert, and they spend 40 years apparently before they find the promised land under Joshua's leadership. And at a certain point, this strange disease breaks out among the children of Israel, the disease of the fiery serpents, and they are suffering and dying from this serpent disease, which is hard to quite understand from the biblical narrative. What does Moses do? He doesn't cast the serpents out of the wilderness. He gets a pole and erects a bronze serpent on it. And it said that when the children of Israel looked at this image of the serpent on the pole, they were healed. So really a classic example of this principle of curing like with like, of elevating and redeeming the serpent by making it rise, again, like the image of the Kundalini serpent rising in that sense. And this image became fundamental to what you could call a form of Western yoga, which is in the tradition of the Kabbalah, where this is a portrayal of the tree of life from kind of a slightly Christianized version of the Jewish Kabbalah, but it's fundamentally coherent, where you see, unlike the chakras of the Eastern tradition, this is shown as what they're called a 10 sephiroth, 10 spheres or sapphires, which again represent energy centers from the Judaic perspective. And you'll see here that the serpent has gradually coiled upwards and reached the crown, as the Kundalini is said to in the Eastern tradition. So again, when the serpent is there, it's the symbol of ignorance and illusion. When the serpent is raised, we're healed of this split from each other and from the world, and the greatest healing and the greatest radiance unfolds. A very classical symbol of healing that hasn't gone away to this day and is still to be seen in the medical profession. So on the two slightly different images, on the left, the caduceus of Hermes. So here you have a central pole with two serpents twining around it and then wings. You'll remember A.E. when he was having his Kundalini experience, he felt these wings around his head. Now, my contention is, from a yogic perspective, from a practitioner perspective, when people engage in these practices, doing the spiritual work, this is a rendition of what is actually shown to them as their reality, as the serpents unfold and the wings spread. So Hermes, obviously, the messenger of the Greek gods, the herald, and thus of that faculty which interprets the spirit to matter and matter to the spirit. So what could be more apposite than the symbol of the light freed and returned to the divine, to the above? Slightly different, the staff of Asclepius. This is the source of the medical symbol. Here you just have one serpent coiled around the pole. So obviously extremely similar to Moses's brazen serpent. Asclepius, the son of Apollo, the great Greek demigod of healing. And the whole of Western medicine, although it seems to have become quite materialistic in some ways, was originally from a religious cult or order of the children of Asclepius. And this was their symbol. I'll pass over the dragon. So I said that wasn't a Kundalini yogi. He was more interested in the serpent power, the coiling power in nature, the fountains of Hecate in the hills, but that it's that same reaching out to heal the split between matter and the spirit that he was so passionate about, reaching incredible levels of poetry again in the Candle of Vision, where he says, I felt instinctively that all I saw in vision was part of the life of earth, which is a court where there are many starry palaces. So the stars are also in the earth. There the planetary spirit was king, and that spirit manifesting through the substance of earth, the mighty mother, was, I felt, the being I groped after as God. So this is A.E. coming to realize that his deepest feeling about the God he had always been looking for was actually the mother, the mighty mother, the great consciousness power in nature. And here again, A.E. has exactly mirrored I think the great insight of the tantric tradition and also the Kabbalistic tradition, because they have the same view, which is God is, if you like to use that word, is both male and female, and neither, but is both. And the male aspect of the divine is very remote. Is your God transcendent? Is is infinitely out there? And the God that we meet here in us, in everything, is the goddess. And Shakti in the Indian tradition is called Shekinah in the Kabbalistic tradition. But it's this feeling that the God we can meet, that can really be there for us, is the mother, is the mighty mother. And I find if I could make one recommendation for anyone here to explore what I'm trying to convey about A's religious, emotional feeling for the world, it would be to read his poetry, to read Homeward Songs by the Way, and get a feeling for there's homeward, which is to find the self, to find God, to leave the illusion behind. And then there's Songs by the Way, which is that I'm going to celebrate the beauty here around me, wherever I go. I don't want to go homeward too soon. And in some of his poetry, there's this incredible tension between I just want to be free and I want to love the beauty now. And you can see there's real suffering at times. And if you chart, in my opinion at least, my response to his poetry, the first 10 years of his poetry, you can see how he found his way from almost a great tension of these opposites to a reconciliation, a kind of druid spirituality of the earth, which was both yogic and fully present and absolutely in love with nature and the feminine principle. So the Great Mother image as two others I've used in this illustration by the Russian theosophist and painter Nikolai Roerich of the Mighty Mother, the Great Mother. So just to conclude by saying A was many things. He was the great organizer, great poet, a great mystic, but I think this love of earth, this love of reality in the sense that we are at home in the world, is one of his great gifts, and he strove towards it, sometimes through this great tension. But if you take a moment after we finish to look at the paintings on this wall, I think you'll see examples of how he exemplified a great work of healing whose full results haven't yet become clear to us in society. This healing between the mystic and the artist, the ascetic yogi and the lover of beauty. And in the past, and I think today, one of the great images that brings all this together is the image of the mother or the goddess. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much. I've said I've spoken a little bit more from the heart than in previous talks, but it's been a real pleasure. I'll draw there now. Thank you to a close there. Thank you very much. So if there are any comments or questions, please, we've still got a few minutes. Patrick.
The obvious one is
Jim.
The tradition of the druids and the serpents and the dragons and things like that. There, of course, you said about the secret part of it. The druids kept a lot of their secrets, unless you were in the inner circle. Like, so they were probably, they probably knew about this stuff.
I would say so. I think one thing that I've become more and more convinced by is that although there are differences between different traditions, beautiful differences, the core, there is a unified core, and the most important things tend to be shared, whether it's in the Druids or in the Native American peoples or in India. Yeah, very much so. The dragon is a whole other thing that we didn't have time to get into, but Jim, yes, absolutely. Patrick.
So when A was dying in Bournemouth, about to undergo his final surgical operations he had, he mentioned to the doctor about the chakras. One of the things we know from Pamela Travers' account is that he's very concerned with being able to leave this material world through death.
Yes.
So the language of the chakras is right there as he approached his death. And there was a whole sense, certainly in Pamela Travers' account, that there was aligning with wisdom in the Bhagavad Gita in terms of leaving this world so that you won't be reborn. Can you comment on, I know these are very mysterious kinds of ideas, can you comment on that sense of chakras and the mastery of the Kundalini allows you to material plane and fulfill the whole purpose of union.
Yes, well, I didn't know that, and thank you. In fact, I'm slightly sad because I do hope that AE comes back and doesn't just, I'm sure, we wish him to have his freedom from the Veil of Tears, but I want him back doing his work. So I hope he didn't fully detach. But no, there's a tradition in the esoteric knowledge of the chakras that the way that you depart from your body at the moment of death determines your existence in the afterlife and also determines your rebirth. So generally the most prized way of departing the body is through the head, through the crown chakra, and that would be the kind of the yogic way to leave through the head. That possibly aligning to Polaris actually, but certainly through the head. Whereas if yogis who leave through the heart or the solar plexus, those would be easier, but would be less elevated, and you'd be more likely to have an afterlife and a new life based more on emotion and with more karma to fulfill in your next life, rather than those that leave through the head. So I would expect that he knew that, and that he was probably aligning to leave in the yogic way, and he would of course be very well prepared, because the Raja Yoga path, the Ashtanga Yoga, is all about gradually purifying the sheath so that you are in a position to leave through the Sahasrara chakra. So I expect it might well have been something like that. I would say that in the context of the Irish revival, the Celtic revival, the linguistic aspect was paramount. I mean, Charles Johnston, with A's great friend, became a significant Sanskrit scholar, one of the an important Western Sanskritist of his time, and he had a very interesting career, which we can't go into. But this whole sense of literary rediscovery, of going to the roots of language, which was political in India, just like it was political in Ireland, because the Indian, although the philosophical texts were being translated from the end of our 18th century onwards, the idea that these texts were of importance to the world and to the West was something that was not universally held in India at the time. And in fact, there were Indian political revival movements towards the end of the 19th century that paralleled what was happening in Ireland for similar reasons, and philology was part of them, as the retrieval of Irish language and the valorization of Irish literature and the language as something that mattered to Irish people at the time was. So I would say if I was to pose the counter question, why were these young Irish men, mostly men, some women, so interested in Sanskrit language, whereas most people who got into theosophy, they read Blavatsky, they read Judge, and they did theosophy. Almost uniquely, the Irish circle became fascinated by, or almost obsessed by, the Indian texts themselves. Charles Johnston becomes this great philologist. Yeats, so enthused by Eastern literature that he gets the theosophical pundit Mohini Chatterjee to come and talk in Dublin about the Eastern texts. And you've got to remember that Yeats is 20, A is 18 at the time. These people are hardcore enthusiasts for Indian literature in a way that I don't think was paralleled in any other theosophical society. So I think this was partly fired by this quest for origins, and I talk about it somewhat more in the book, The History of Irish Magic, where I think there's also, I don't want to say too much about this, but I would dare say, particularly to Irish or Anglo-Irish men of a Protestant background who were not from a Catholic background but could not relate to or were falling, let's say, out of sympathy with their Presbyterian background to a degree, this third space of Indian philosophy, this idea that we're not trapped in religious sectarian areas. Which branch of Christianity do we have to choose? Maybe the problem all along was we've lost contact with our ancient roots in India. So this idea that maybe the roots of Irish literature, the roots of Indian literature and culture are the same root, was inspiring and was connected with that. But that's a much bigger talk. So I hope that in some way answers your question. Okay.
The painting you showed of Pegasus, the figure in it has the Sacred Heart in it, and where Ishikri has a lot of.
I'll just go back to Bellerophon and Pegasus right at the beginning. Yeah.
So the Sacred Heart is in the center.
Yes.
The Irish word for Sacred Heart is Ishikri. Apparently, it is very close resemblance to Sanskrit word for Sacred Heart.
Possibly. Well, I'll come back to you on that, Jim. But I mean, but all our languages are of the same family. So in that sense, one of the reasons that the German scholars took to Sanskrit studies so keenly in the 19th century was because they saw how many words were shared between Sanskrit and German, because all of the languages of this family, including English, all the Romance languages, Irish, they all have this Indo-European root. So linguistically, we're all of one family, and you can see our words for the numbers 1 to 10 are basically the same sound in all of those languages, and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't be surprised. There are local differences. Sorry, I'm just going to ask for your indulgence because I need to do a little bit of promotion. So I'm just going to flick back through the slides here for a little bit of commerce, because I'd be remiss if I didn't say this is the book, History of Irish Magic, that my wife Sally and I published last year. Magic in the broadest sense of spirituality, imagination, myth, but also druidry. Everything from fairy lore, witches in Irish tradition, Christian saints and their miracles, which are strangely similar to things associated with the Druids before them, all the way through to A.E. himself and those who were influenced by him, and everything in between. So I do have, I think, 3 copies. If anyone hasn't got one and would like one, I'm doing a little discount today, so please see me after if you're interested. And Patrick, thank you so much for your kind words about the book. And lastly, our most recent republication of Ella Young's wonderful autobiography, Flowering Dusk. Ella Young was a friend of A.E., a poet and a revolutionary, a great champion of Irish independence, a teacher of Irish language and myth in Dublin, and an all-round wonderful person. And her autobiography is gripping reading. It has been out of print since it was printed during World War II when she was in her last years in California, and we've just reissued it. I can recommend one of the things for the A.E. Society that I think makes Flowering Dusk appealing is there are very few really gripping first-hand accounts of what these people were like, of what A.E. was like. We have the image of him as the great man, which he was, but as it were, almost reportage descriptions of what A.E. was like as a person, how he spoke, the impression he made on people in his 20s. Ella Young is a uniquely vivid writer, and her descriptions of A.E. and Yeats and that circle are hilarious and I think inspiring and exciting. So we're thrilled to have Flowering Dusk out, and we also have a couple of copies of that if anyone would like to pick one up. So that's the commercial out. Do we have one more question?
Just one little mention. Ella Young donated some of the paintings in the exhibition.
Do we know which painting?
Yeah, it's written on.
Oh.
Over there is her sister.
Oh, that's Elizabeth. Yeah, the great actress. Yeah. No, fantastic. I mean, yeah, Ella Young. Just to say a few words about her, she had a life of 2 parts, and the 2 parts of her life are really exemplified in the way she wrote the book. She has a first half of her life where she is a central member of the Celtic revival, and then in 1925 she went to America and never returned. And she has a second life there as probably the great educator and popularizer of Irish mythology, Irish culture in America. And she found fertile fields, particularly in California. She lived both at the beginning and the end of her time in America in a theosophical community called Halcyon, which was partly run, or let's say one of the leading figures had been two friends of AE from the 1890s, John and Agnes Varian. And I always like to mention this because it just shows AE's influence, that the Varian's first child was called Russell. In fact, their two children were Russell and Sigurd. And the reason that Russell and Sigurd Varian are interesting is because they were two of the pioneers of Silicon Valley. And they exemplified the kind of thing that could happen in a Californian theosophical community at the beginning of the 20th century. I've been talking about subtle energy in the way that AE experienced and believed in it. And of course, 300 years ago, people were very suspicious of the idea of subtle energy. They would have thought maybe it was demonic, or the religious people would have thought it was demonic. The scientists would have said it was nonsense. But then electricity was discovered, magnetism, radio. So by the beginning of the 20th century, the idea of subtle energies was quite easy to comprehend. But theosophists tended to be interested in science, and Russell and Sigurd were two devil children almost, playing with electricity and electrocuting people, having fun, playing in this spiritual community. And the creativity of their life, typically Californian of the time, was what enabled them to make these inventions, which put them at the beginning of Silicon Valley. So I think an example of how science and spirituality aren't necessarily at loggerheads, but can be together.
Comment on that, James. So parallel jobs. Steve Jobs' mother was a receptionist at Varian Associates in Palo Alto. We used to go visit her. So all the way from the A. Russell through the Varians to the Varian Associates. There's a lingering resonance even there. When you open up your phone, you're using your smartphone, you're still picking up on that resonance of the Varian.
Is there time for me just to make another comment on that, Sean, or should we?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. Okay. I'd love to just say a little bit more about Ella Young's importance, because obviously the autobiography speaks for itself. It's a gripping read. But Yeats and AE in the 1890s were very concerned by the reawakening of Irish magic, Irish spirituality. And AE particularly was having visions about where this renaissance might be happening. He had an intuition that there was this figure he called the Irish Avatar, this great Irish spirit who was going to reawaken Irish culture in its fullest creative potential. And he told Yeats he'd seen visions of the Avatar in the West in a cottage, and he was always convinced that the center of this reawakening was somewhere in the West. But the work that Yeats was doing at the time with AE was to try to revive. Yeats called it a Celtic Mysteries order, and he partly patterned it on what he learnt from the Golden Dawn. But the root idea was a kind of chivalry, a Celtic chivalry of ceremony and mythological excellence. So he had this idea of the Castle of the Heroes, which was going to be for a while in a castle on Loch Key in Roscommon. And Yeats was going to get all his friends, his poet influences, and they were going to do ceremonies and recite wonderful poetry to each other and inspire each other, and be the vanguard of this kind of cultural revolution. Yeats was always stronger on the cultural revolution than the actual gritty boots on the ground revolution. But Yeats's ability to create those Celtic mysteries slightly waned. He'd hoped that Maud Gonne would marry him and that they could be the king and queen of the Castle of Heroes, and it didn't happen, and Yeats went and did other things. But Maud Gonne never gave up on her enthusiasm for the work they'd done, retrieving this through intuition and magic, this ancient druidic lore, this Celtic lore. And Maud Gonne worked with Ella Young on this. They did Irish magic, and some of the details of this are not still fully understood. but they, Ella Young, and we think with Maud Gonne and a few other women, because it was mostly the women doing this, they revived the ceremony. They revived the practice of enacting ceremony at Beltane, Lunsar, Samhain, and Imbolc. And this has become a massive part of the pagan revival, if you like. But some people think it came through Wicca. Well, to a degree in America it did. But as far as I can see, the people that revived the celebration of the ancient Irish festivals as religious entities was Maud Gonne and Ella Young and a small circle. And Ella Young took this to America when she moved there. She was calling it the Fellowship of the Four Jewels, which are the four treasures of the Indo-Tibetan. But in America, it becomes the Fellowship of Shasta. But she was still giving almost Sanskrit mantras to her students and co-workers, one of whom was Ansel Adams, the great photographer. The circle that she was working with, which is partly this fascinating Californian collection of like the Junites and the people connected with the redwoods and the proto-hippies, you might almost say. Ella Young was modeling a kind of Celtic spirituality decades ahead of its time, but she influenced certain neo-pagans who then seeded her ideas into the American neo-pagan movement. So wherever there are people saying, I'm a Wiccan priestess from an ancient Celtic lineage, and really what they're talking about is something that came from A. and Yeats and Ella Young and Maud Gonne and went to America. And it's not really appreciated that once again, A was at the beginning of a great pagan reawakening. I'll stop there because that's a whole other talk.